The overnight shift at the Ozon logistics complex in Chapayevsk had every reason to believe their workplace was about as far from the war as a Russian company could get. Conveyor belts moved packages toward delivery trucks the way they did every night, processing a share of the roughly 215,000 orders the facility handled each day. Phone cases, kitchen appliances, children's toys, the ordinary churn of a country's second-largest online marketplace. The complex had only existed since late October 2022, one of the newest additions to Ozon's national warehouse network, built to serve the Volga region's growing appetite for next-day delivery in a country where, for most residents, the war remained something that happened on television rather than at the loading dock. Sorters, forklift operators, and shift supervisors moved through a routine that had nothing to do with military logistics in any way its own employees would have recognized. Barcode scanners beeping, pallets shuttled between racking aisles, delivery vans queued at the yard waiting their turn to load. Nobody sorting boxes that night had any reason to think a Ukrainian targeting list had quietly added their building to it months earlier, after officials concluded that a company built to move consumer packages efficiently across Russia had become useful for moving something else as well. By morning, the complex 135,000 square meters of warehouse space, built at a cost of roughly 5 billion rubles, and opened less than 4 years earlier, was burning across most of its footprint. More than 500 employees had been evacuated. Ozon confirmed the strike, confirmed the fire, and confirmed that people had been injured, without specifying how many or how badly. It was the first time in the war that Ozon itself had been hit. It was not, however, the first time Ukraine had targeted a Russian e-commerce warehouse. Since the middle of June, Ukrainian drones had struck Wildberries, Russia's largest online retailer and Ozon's chief competitor, more than 20 separate times, a pace of roughly 2 strikes a week sustained for over 2 months against a single company's infrastructure. Ukrainian officials have alleged that Wildberries' warehouses, alongside their obvious civilian function, have also been used to move military-linked goods, including components for drones, blurring the line between ordinary consumer logistics and the supply chains that keep Russia's war effort running. The Kremlin has denied that Wildberries supplies Russian forces in any capacity. Neither Ukraine's military nor Firepoint, the drone manufacturer that confirmed its FP-1 drones carried out the Ozon strike, made the same specific allegation about Ozon itself. What Ukraine did do was extend a campaign already running against one national retailer to include its closest rival. On the same logic and with the same class of weapon, a shorter range, more expendable strike drone than the Flamingo cruise missiles the same manufacturer has used against targets deeper inside Russia, appropriate for a target barely inside the country's interior rather than hundreds of kilometers past it. The Wildberries campaign did not begin as a single dramatic announcement. It accumulated, strike by strike, warehouse by warehouse, across the second half of the summer, until the pattern itself became the story. A major Russian retailer absorbing a level of sustained, repeated military attention that, before this year, had typically been reserved for oil infrastructure, ammunition depots, and air bases. Each individual Wildberries strike drew a predictable response from the company. A statement confirming a fire, an assurance that operations would resume, sometimes a note about injuries, and each one added another data point to an argument Ukrainian officials had been making with increasing confidence. That Russia's consumer logistics giants, built originally to move ordinary retail goods at enormous scale and speed, had become an attractive, semi-hidden channel for moving components that mattered rather more. Precisely because a shipment of drone parts is far easier to lose inside 215,000 daily parcels than inside a dedicated military supply convoy that Ukrainian intelligence already knows to watch. Whether that logic was airtight in every one of more than 20 strikes is not something either side has ever laid out in public detail. What is observable is that the campaign kept going, strike after strike, rather than stopping after the first one failed to produce an obvious military payoff. There is a difficult economic logic underlying the whole approach that has nothing to do with whether any individual warehouse actually stored drone components. Wildberries and Ozon between them handle a meaningful share of Russia's domestic retail economy, employing tens of thousands of people and moving goods that keep ordinary consumer life functioning in a country whose citizens have, for the most part, been shielded from the war's daily material costs. A campaign that forces both companies to spend heavily on relocated inventory, damaged infrastructure, insurance costs, and security upgrades, imposes a real economic drag on the Russian home front, regardless of whether a single drone part ever passed through either company's warehouses, a form of pressure that does not require proving a dual-use allegation to be effective, only requires the strikes to keep happening. That gap between allegation and confirmation is where this particular story gets genuinely uncertain, and it is worth sitting with rather than resolving artificially. There are, broadly, two explanations for why a company whose public identity is built entirely around same-day delivery and customer reviews ended up on a list of targets worth flying an armed drone toward. The first is the one Ukrainian officials have leaned on publicly for months, that Russia's e-commerce giants, whatever else they do, have become part of the informal logistics network, moving dual-use components, electronics, small parts, the unglamorous building blocks of a drone, or a piece of military hardware across a wartime economy that no longer draws a clean line between a civilian marketplace and a military supply chain. If that allegation holds for Wildberries, there is no obvious reason it would not eventually extend to Ozon, simply as a matter of which company processes the next relevant shipment. The mechanics of that allegation, when Ukrainian officials have described them at all, tend to focus less on any company policy and more on how easily a marketplace platform built around anonymous third-party sellers can be exploited by anyone determined to move restricted goods without drawing obvious attention. A platform processing hundreds of thousands of daily orders from thousands of independent sellers has, by design, limited visibility into what any single package actually contains beyond the label its seller chooses to apply. Whether that structural vulnerability has actually been exploited at meaningful scale by anyone connected to Russia's military procurement network, as opposed to being a theoretical opening any large e-commerce platform shares, is precisely the kind of claim that is far easier to assert than to verify from outside an intelligence service's own files. Ukrainian officials have made the assertion repeatedly and publicly enough that it has become the default explanation offered for the entire campaign. Independent verification of it, in any specific instance, has been considerably harder to come by. The second explanation has less to do with parcels and more to do with geography. The Ozon complex in Chapayevsk sits within a few kilometers of a genuinely old piece of Russian military-industrial infrastructure, the Chapayevsk mechanical plant, a facility that has manufactured industrial explosives and detonation components, blasting caps, detonating cord, pyrotechnic relays since long before Ozon existed as a company, alongside a second enterprise, Promsyntes, with a similar explosives industry pedigree. Together, the two plants have functioned for decades as a single, if quietly maintained, explosives production cluster. A strike package targeting that broader industrial corridor does not need Ozon's warehouse to be secretly moving drone parts for the complex to end up damaged simply by virtue of sitting inside the same few square kilometers as a legitimate, much older military target. Chapayevsk's relationship with explosives manufacturing did not begin with this war, or even with the Soviet Union's later decades. The town was built up around chemical and munitions production from the early 20th century onward, one of a cluster of closed or semi-closed industrial cities across the Volga region whose entire economic identity was organized around producing the raw materials of war propellants, explosives, chemical precursors largely out of public view, decades before satellite imagery and open-source intelligence made that kind of concealment substantially harder to maintain. A visitor driving through the area today would see much of what any Russian industrial town looks like: modest apartment blocks, a rail spur, fenced compounds with unremarkable signage. The plants inside those fences have simply kept doing, in a much smaller and more constrained form after the Soviet collapse, roughly what they were built to do the better part of a century ago. Ozon's decision to build a modern logistics hub nearby in 2022 was almost certainly driven by ordinary commercial factors: available land, road, and rail access, proximity to the regional population it needed to serve, with no obvious connection to the older industrial neighbors next door. That the two ended up sharing a few square kilometers of Samara Oblast is either an unfortunate coincidence for a delivery company or a detail that mattered a great deal to whoever built the target list, and from the outside there is no clean way to tell which. A strike package planner working from satellite imagery and a map of known military-industrial sites does not necessarily distinguish cleanly between the explosives plant and the enormous modern warehouse next door, when both sit inside the same tight radius, and the operational goal is disrupting an entire industrial corridor rather than a single named building. Whether Ozon's warehouse was struck because it was itself believed to be dual use, or because it happened to sit close enough to a genuinely legitimate military target to be caught in the same strike package's effective radius, produces the same photograph of a burning warehouse either way. The distinction matters enormously for how the strike should be understood. It matters much less for what actually happened to the building. A same-day delivery warehouse now had a fulfillment problem considerably larger than a late package, and for once, nothing about it was arriving on schedule. The choice of weapons says something on its own. The FP-1 is not the Flamingo Firepoint's long-range cruise missile, built to carry an 1,100-kilogram warhead close to 3,000 kilometers into Russia's interior, but a smaller, shorter-range strike drone, cheaper to build and, by design, more expendable per unit. Deploying that class of weapon against a target barely across the regional threshold rather than deep in Russia's interior is not a sign of technical limitation. It is closer to a statement about how Ukraine now allocates its strike inventory. Expensive, long-range weapons get reserved for targets that genuinely require reaching hundreds of kilometers past heavily defended airspace rocket factories, flight test centers, explosives plants sitting far enough inland that nothing shorter ranged could get there at all. A target within Samara Oblast's outer reach, however contested the airspace along the way, does not need that expense. It needs a weapon cheap enough to send in numbers sufficient to guarantee a handful get through, which is precisely the strategic niche a shorter-range strike drone like the FP-1 exists to fill. Matching weapon cost to target value is not an afterthought in a war being fought this intensively on both economic and military fronts. It is close to the entire discipline. Neither explanation excludes the other, and Ukraine's own public statements have not settled which one, if either, was the actual planning rationale. What is confirmed is simpler and less satisfying than either theory. FP-1 drones flew into Samara Oblast's air defense envelope, a region defended seriously enough that Ukrainian strike packages routinely rely on low-altitude routing and the same radar horizon gaps that have let previous formations reach targets deep in the region and reach the Ozon complex regardless. Samara's governor, Vyacheslav Fedorishchev, claimed the broader overnight attack had been repelled, a claim that sat uneasily beside satellite and ground video showing a fire consuming most of a 135,000 square meter building by daybreak. The same overnight operation reached a second, considerably less ambiguous target a short distance away, the Novokuibyshevsk oil refinery, part of the Rosneft group, with a design capacity of roughly 8.8 million tons of crude oil a year and a product line that includes liquefied gases, MTBE, benzene, and other petrochemical feedstocks alongside its fuel output. Refined products from Novokuibyshevsk include jet fuel that supplies Russian military aviation directly, which places the facility inside a category of target Ukraine has never needed to justify with a theory about dual-use logistics. Videos from the strike showed at least 3 separate fires burning across the Samara Oblast targets that night, thick columns of smoke visible well before sunrise. Whatever ambiguity surrounds the reasoning behind the Ozon strike, none of it extends to the refinery burning less than an hour's drive away. A reminder that the same overnight strike package can carry 2 entirely different kinds of justification bundled into a single operation, one openly military and one still being argued about in public. Novokuibyshevsk did not burn in isolation from the rest of Ukraine's refinery campaign either. Between mid-April and mid-July of this year alone, Ukrainian forces are estimated to have struck Russian oil refining facilities roughly 50 separate times, reaching at least 24 of the country's 34 major refineries in that stretch. Independent analysts tracking Russia's refining output have reported that the country's oil processing volumes had, by that point, fallen to their lowest level in more than 2 decades, a statistic that says less about any single strike, including this one, and more about what sustained, repeated pressure against a fixed category of target can accomplish over months rather than a single dramatic night. A refinery that gets struck once can often return to partial operation within weeks. An entire national refining sector struck dozens of times across a single season has considerably less room to recover between attacks, and the cumulative effect shows up not in any one fire, but in the national production statistics themselves. Targeting economic infrastructure rather than purely military hardware is not a new idea in the history of warfare, even if its application to a specific online retailer's warehouse feels novel. Strategic bombing campaigns going back to the Second World War have repeatedly grappled with the same underlying argument, that a country's capacity to fight a war depends on its economy as a whole, not only on the factories that make weapons directly, and that degrading the broader economic base can shorten a war, even when no single strike destroys a piece of military hardware. That argument has always been contested, then and now, because it runs directly into the difficulty of proving, in any individual case, that a specific piece of civilian infrastructure was meaningfully supporting the war effort rather than simply existing in the same country as the war. Ukraine's campaign against Wildberries and now Ozon sits squarely inside that old argument, updated for a conflict fought as much through drone strikes and open-source verification as through the mass bomber formations of an earlier era. The tools have changed considerably. The underlying strategic question, how much of a wartime economy counts as a legitimate target, has not been resolved by any of them. Open-source channels on both sides of the war spent the days after the strike arguing over which explanation fit the evidence better, largely without new information capable of settling it. Pro-Ukrainian commentary tended to foreground the dual-use logistics theory, treating the Ozon strike as simple continuity with the Wildberries campaign, and pointing to the shared use of FP-1 drones as evidence the two campaigns were, in Ukrainian planning terms, essentially the same operation extended to a second company. Russian commentary, including some voices otherwise willing to criticize their own government's air defense performance, tended to emphasize the Chapayevsk mechanical plant's proximity instead, framing the Ozon damage as incidental to a strike aimed at older, more clearly legitimate military-industrial infrastructure nearby, a framing that, notably, still concedes the region contains a real military target worth striking, while disputing that the warehouse itself was ever the point. Neither framing has produced anything resembling documentary proof. Both remain internally consistent with the same set of publicly available facts. One warehouse, 2 nearby explosives, plants, and a Ukrainian government that has, so far, said only enough to confirm the strike happened and to attribute it to its long-running campaign against Russian retail logistics, without specifying which of the two available justifications actually drove the targeting decision. What makes this particular ambiguity worth dwelling on, rather than treating as an unremarkable feature of wartime reporting, is how little it actually changes about the physical outcome. Two competing narratives can circulate indefinitely, each cited by people already inclined to believe it, while the warehouse itself remains burned, regardless of which story eventually gains wider acceptance. That asymmetry between how quickly the damage becomes fact and how slowly, if ever, the justification for it becomes equally clear is close to a defining feature of this entire phase of the war, playing out identically whether the target in question is an aircraft on a test center ramp or a package sorting warehouse in a town most people outside Samara Oblast had never heard of before this week. By 7:30 the following morning, fire had spread across most of the Ozon complex's footprint, and the company confirmed that operations at the site had been suspended. The 500 employees evacuated that night went home, or to a hospital, rather than back to a shift sorting packages. Ozon's own statement specified injuries without listing a death toll, and no fatalities at the warehouse itself have been confirmed. That single detail, a major logistics hub reduced to a burning shell, with the human cost limited mostly to injuries and a halted supply chain rather than a body count, is itself part of what makes this strike a difficult one to file neatly, alongside a rocket factory or an ammunition depot. It caused real economic damage to a real company employing thousands of ordinary Russians whose jobs have nothing to do with the war, whatever the strike's underlying justification turns out to have been. For a facility built 4 years ago specifically to serve one of Russia's fastest-growing consumer markets, the practical consequence is straightforward, regardless of the strategic debate above it. Deliveries across the Volga region that used to route through Chapayevsk will, for some period of weeks or months, have to route somewhere else, at whatever additional cost and delay that rerouting requires, while the company decides how much of the burned facility is worth rebuilding on the same exposed site. What this strike ultimately demonstrates has less to do with any single warehouse and more to do with where the line dividing military and civilian infrastructure has actually settled. 3.5 years into a war that has spent much of that time eroding it. A company that exists to sell phone cases and kitchen appliances does not, on its face, belong on a target list built around ammunition plants and radar stations. But a wartime economy does not organize itself along the categories a peacetime observer would recognize, and once officials on one side conclude that a supposedly civilian supply chain has started carrying military-relevant cargo, the distinction between a legitimate target and an ordinary business becomes a matter of intelligence assessment rather than obvious fact. Whether that assessment was correct for Ozon specifically may never be publicly confirmed. What is already clear is that Wildberries' 20-odd strikes were not a one-time exception, and that in this war, a delivery company's own logistics network can end up treated as an extension of the war it never asked to be part of. There is also a broader pattern worth naming plainly, one that extends well past this single warehouse. Ukraine's targeting has, over the course of this year, steadily widened its definition of what counts as war-relevant infrastructure from refineries and ammunition plants, whose military relevance nobody seriously disputes, to flight test centers and rocket factories building the hardware Russia has not yet fielded, to explosives manufacturing towns whose economic identity has been quietly organized around war production for a century, and now, apparently, to the consumer logistics networks that keep those towns and everything around them supplied with the ordinary goods of daily life. Each expansion of that target set has followed a similar internal logic. Identify where a civilian-looking system intersects with the machinery of the war, and treat that intersection as sufficient grounds to strike, regardless of how much of the underlying facility's activity remains entirely unrelated to the war effort. Applied narrowly and accurately, that logic can genuinely degrade a war machine by cutting the unglamorous connective tissue, the parts, the fuel, the everyday shipments that a purely military-focused targeting list would miss entirely. Applied loosely, the same logic risks treating an ever larger share of an entire economy as fair game simply because a plausible-sounding connection to the war can be drawn from almost any sufficiently large piece of national infrastructure, given enough motivation to look for one. Where the Ozon strike falls on that spectrum is precisely the question this video cannot answer with certainty, and precisely the question worth asking every time this kind of target appears on a strike report from either side of this war. If the campaign continues at the pace it has so far, Ozon's first strike is unlikely to be its last, and the list of Russian companies discovering that their supply chains sit closer to the war than their own executives ever advertised is, on the available evidence, still growing. What began in June as a campaign against a single retailer's warehouses has, in a little over 2 months, become a broader test of how far the definition of a legitimate wartime target can stretch before the label stops, meaning anything distinct at all. A test this war, on both sides, has been running for 3.5 years without ever quite reaching a stable answer. If you think the strike was really about disrupting military-linked logistics through Ozon itself, or think it had more to do with the explosives plants sitting nearby, say which explanation you find more convincing in the comments below. If you want more reconstructions like this one, breaking down exactly what a single strike does and does not tell us, consider subscribing to the channel. Peace for Ukraine, and let us hope wars like this come to an end soon. Goodbye.